It begins with a single faded photograph, one that should never have existed. A small glass plate negative, dated May 1873, unearthed from the cellar of a forgotten home in Vermont. The image is crude by modern standards, grainy and ghostly, yet its composition carries a sense of unsettling precision. At its center stands a man, alone in his studio. The wooden tripod, the chemical trays, the faint outline of an open window. His name, written in delicate script along the margin, reads Elias Kent, self. But the longer you look, the more impossible it becomes to explain what you're seeing. Behind him, or perhaps beside him, there's a blurred reflection of the same man, slumped and motionless, as if captured at the exact instant life left his body. Historians would later call it the Kent exposure, a photograph that appeared to record not only a man's likeness, but the moment of his own death. The paradox was irresistible. How could a photographer in 1873 have captured his own final moment? Was it suicide, an accident of chemistry, or something far stranger? A deliberate attempt to witness the passage between life and whatever comes after. The image surfaced publicly only once, shown briefly at a small Vermont museum, before vanishing again into private hands. Yet even a single viewing was enough to provoke decades of debate, from skeptics, artists and scientists alike. For nearly a century, most dismissed it as a darkroom mistake, a case of double exposure or misalignment. But buried among Kent's belongings, researchers later found something that forced them to reconsider. A note written in his own hand. Just weeks before his death, it read simply, "I will capture what the eye cannot see." And with that, the mystery began. To understand Elias Kent, you have to understand his time, a country still haunted by loss. The year was 1873, less than a decade after the American Civil War had torn through cities and families alike. Death had become a familiar visitor in nearly every household, and the new art of photography offered something unprecedented, the power to hold on, if only in image. Across the country, men and women turned to cameras not just to record life, but to preserve death. Known as mourning portraits, these photographs were often taken in the hours after a loved one had passed, a final attempt to capture presence before absence took hold. Eyes were painted open by hand, cheeks tinted to suggest warmth. It was not morbid. It was mercy. In the quiet town of Montpelier, Vermont, one photographer became known for the tenderness of his post-mortem images. Elias Kent, born in 1838, was a man of stillness and precision. His surviving record, a ledger now, kept at the Vermont Historical Society, list over 300. Sittings between 1867 and 1873, half were mourning portraits. Kent's studio sat above a cobbler's shop on Main Street, its tall windows flooding the space with northern light. He worked with the collodion wet plate process, a technique requiring the photographer to coat, expose, and develop the plate within minutes, a race against time and chemistry. Exposure times ran long, sometimes as much as 30 seconds. Subjects had to remain motionless, often supported by iron stands hidden behind their backs. Any movement meant ruin. His surviving negatives, fragile glass plates washed in silver nitrate, reveal an artist devoted to clarity and grace. Local obituaries mention him by name, describing his calm manner and near-sacred respect for the departed. But among his many portraits, one entry stands apart in his ledger. Dated May 14, 1873, it reads simply, "Self, full exposure, no client name. No payment recorded, only a notation in the margin, for the experiment." When archivists rediscovered that glass plate nearly 60 years later, they found more than a self-portrait. In the dim reflection of Kent's studio mirror, faint and nearly lost to time, appeared something no one could account for. A second figure, bent at the waist as if collapsing, and with that image, the boundary between art and mortality began to blur. For more than 60 years, Elias Kent's name drifted quietly into the past, a footnote in local records, a craftsman from another century. His studio was dismantled, his belongings scattered, his death largely forgotten, until the summer of 1937, when a small discovery brought his story back to life. That year, a heavy storm struck the outskirts of Montpelier. During cleanup, workers clearing an abandoned home on Elm Street found a wooden storage crate sealed beneath rotted floorboards. Inside, wrapped in layers of linen and straw, were dozens of glass plate negatives, their emulsion cracked, but their subject still faintly visible beneath the silver. When the find was reported to the Vermont Historical Society, a local historian named Martha Duval volunteered to clean and catalogue them. Duval was not a professional conservator, but she had spent years collecting early American photographs. She recognized at once the markings of the 1870s, the handwriting, the plate size, the varnish. On one fragile sleeve, she found a neat inscription in fading ink, Self, May 1873. Duval later wrote in her notes that the image was strangely still, and yet unsettling. It showed a man, Kent, standing before his camera. The background was sparse, a draped chair, a hanging cloth, the edge of a wooden frame. His posture seemed rigid, but his gaze was distant, unfocused. And in the reflection of a small rear mirror behind him, barely visible through the age-worn glass, there appeared another figure. It was the same man. But the mirrored version of Kent seemed to be collapsing forward, his shoulders sagging, his head angled toward the floor, as though caught in the act of falling. From the beginning, interpretations split into three camps. The first saw it as a simple accident of long exposure. Kent moved during the process, leaving a spectral blur. Others proposed a double exposure error, two images layered by mistake on a single plate. But a smaller, more curious group wondered whether the photograph had somehow captured the precise moment his body gave out, the instant between stillness and death. To most, such an idea sounded impossible. Yet fragments of historical record began to lend the theory an uneasy plausibility. A local newspaper from May 16, 1873, reported that Mr. Elias Kent, photographer of Main Street, was found deceased within his studio, having succumbed to sudden illness. The same article mentioned that neighbors had heard a crash of glass and overturned furniture that afternoon. Shopkeeper next door later told an interviewer that Kent had been working alone all day, arranging the big camera for one of his experiments. No one saw him alive again. The dates aligned perfectly. Kent's self-portrait, labeled May 1873, matched the week of his death. His ledger listed no clients beyond that point. For years, the mystery remained confined to a handful of local historians. The image was too damaged for public display, too fragile to restore. Most who saw it dismissed the anomaly as chemical decay, an illusion of light. But time has a way of preserving what it shouldn't. In 1998, when Duval's descendants donated her personal collection to the State Archive, Kent's photograph resurfaced once more, this time in the hands of a professional restorer. Under magnification and ultraviolet light, faint details began to emerge that had never been visible before, and what those restorers found would challenge everything. Experts thought they knew about the image and about the final moments of Elias Kent. When Kent's fragile glass plate resurfaced in 1998, few expected it to yield anything new. More than a century had passed since the exposure. Time, humidity, and careless handling had already done their quiet damage. The emulsion was flaking. The varnish had yellowed. But for Dr. Henry Lawton, a senior conservator at the Vermont Historical Society, the photograph represented more than a relic. It was a puzzle. Lawton specialized in early photographic processes, daguerreotypes, ambrotypes, and wet plates like Kent's. His task was to stabilize the negative for archival storage, not to analyze it. Yet as he examined the plate under magnification, something in the mirrored portion of the image caught his attention. A faint, irregular shadow that didn't align with any part of Kent's visible body. He decided to take a closer look. Using ultraviolet illumination, Lawton photographed the negative at multiple wavelengths, capturing the hidden layers of the emulsion that normal light couldn't reveal. Then, through digital enhancement, a process that isolates tonal values without altering structure, he restored the contrast just enough to make the image legible. Again, what emerged was unsettling. Behind the upright figure of Elias Kent stood a second form, unmistakably human but slumped, its head bowed toward the ground. The clothing, the dark waistcoat, the rolled sleeves, matched Kent's exactly. The features, though blurred, carried the same angular profile. It looked unmistakably like the same man photographed twice, once standing and once fallen. The discovery was published quietly in a regional archival bulletin, but word spread quickly through photographic circles. For some, it was proof of a double exposure, a known if uncommon occurrence in wet plate photography. For others, the precision of the alignment was too perfect to be accidental. To test the theory, Lawton invited Dr. Miriam O'Shea, a photographic historian from Boston University, to examine the plate. Her analysis confirmed that the exposure time, based on chemical density and ambient lighting, was likely between 20 and 25 seconds, long enough for minor motion blur, but not long enough to create two full distinct images. If it were a standard double exposure, O'Shea wrote, the secondary image would overlay or ghost across the primary subject. This does not. It appears sequential, as if the camera witnessed two consecutive states of the same person. That phrase, two consecutive states, would ignite the deeper debate. A forensic imaging analyst, reviewing high-resolution scans of the plate, concluded there were no indications of post-exposure manipulation. No retouching marks, no revarnishing, no chemical reapplication. The plate, in his words, was a single unbroken emulsion, exposed once and developed in continuity. If that were true, then Kent's photograph captured something photography was never meant to record: transition. To understand what might have driven such an experiment, researchers turned to Kent's surviving letters and journals, preserved in part by a distant relative. Within them, scattered across mundane studio notes, were glimpses of an obsession. Light, he wrote in one entry, is the faithful witness. It does not lie, it does not pity. If the soul departs, the glass will know it first. In another, dated March 1873, only weeks before his death, I will attempt a self-exposure not for vanity, but for proof. To seize the instant the spirit leaves the frame, that is the true art. Kent's words suggest he saw photography not just as craft, but as spiritual experiment, a means to capture something beyond flesh. In his era, this idea was far from unique. The late 19th century was consumed by spiritualism, seances, spirit photographs, and attempts to document the unseen. But Kent's approach was different, systematic, methodical, almost scientific. A psychologist interviewed for a later documentary described Kent's mindset as a form of grief-driven fixation. Having lost his wife and daughter to illness the previous year, he may have sought a way to prove that death was not an erasure, but a continuation, one that light itself could reveal. For Kent, the expert said, immortality wasn't a belief. It was a formula he was trying to solve. Yet amid his careful experimentation, one mystery deepened. Among the plates recovered from the cellar, one was left undeveloped. Its surface was blackened by chemical corrosion, as though someone had poured acid across it intentionally. The label was nearly gone, but one fragment remained. XP2, same apparatus. Why would someone destroy a second exposure, and so deliberately? As Lawton continued his cataloguing, he found one more fragment among Kent's belongings, a torn page from a notebook. Its ink barely legible, the handwriting unmistakably his. It read, "Tomorrow I shall begin at dawn. When the light enters the lens, it will take with it the hour my soul departs." And for the first time in over a century, it seemed Elias Kent might have meant it literally. To understand the photograph, historians turned their attention not to the image itself, but to the final days that led up to it. The fragments of Elias Kent's life, preserved in census records, local obituaries and family correspondence, begin to form a portrait far more human and far more tragic than anyone expected. In 1870, Kent lived with his wife Margaret and their 6-year-old daughter Clara on a small plot just outside Montpellier. His studio provided modest income, enough to sustain them. Surviving letters show a quiet domestic life, evenings spent reading, gardening, and working late by lamplight on photographic experiments that fascinated him endlessly. But in the winter of 1872, an epidemic of scarlet fever swept through Vermont. Within a span of 6 weeks, both Margaret and Clara were gone. Their deaths are recorded in the town's burial register, December 17th and January 3rd. In a single season, Kent's home fell silent. The grief seems to have altered him permanently. Letters to a close friend, Reverend Paul Layton, show a shift from warmth to fixation. "The light," he wrote, "knows what endures after the body's stillness. I will find a way to let it show me." He began photographing Clara's toys, her empty chair, the rooms where she once played, always by natural light, as if sunlight itself might reveal what remained. In early 1873, Kent began a series of experiments noted in his ledger simply as tests. Each involved extended exposure times, mirrors, and timed mechanical triggers. One surviving sketch depicts a self-triggering shutter, rigged by weights and cords, a crude but ingenious mechanism that allowed the camera to expose a plate without anyone behind it. Such designs were virtually unheard of in 1873. Kent may have built one of the earliest examples in existence. By May, his entries grew increasingly introspective. In one of his final letters, dated May 10, 1873, he wrote to Leighton again, "I believe I can record not only the face but the passage, the transition between being seen and being gone. If the soul departs as light leaves the body, then the glass will keep what remains. The camera shall keep what I cannot." 4 days later, Elias Kent was found dead in his studio. The coroner's record lists heart failure, probable stress, and exhaustion. There was no sign of struggle, no evidence of poison or deliberate harm. Only a toppled tripod, a broken lamp, and a glass plate resting in the chemical tray still damp with developer. For over a century, that plate was assumed to be his final portrait. Yet no one truly understood the depth of what it recorded until 2004, when high-resolution digital scans became available for analysis. Using spectral imaging, researchers examined variations in density across the emulsion. What they found suggested something extraordinary. A luminous arc near Kent's right arm, faint but measurable, consistent with a sudden shift in exposure during motion. When modeled digitally, the pattern corresponded precisely with the fall of a human body, collapsing mid-exposure. The time frame, roughly 2 seconds, aligned with the shutter mechanism Kent had designed and a delayed trigger that could have fired automatically after he positioned himself in front of the camera. The implication was chilling and yet oddly beautiful. Kent had engineered the means to photograph himself at the exact moment his body gave way. Not through intent of death, but through an artist's relentless pursuit to merge his life's work with his final truth. He was not escaping life, he was documenting it in its departure. Historians revisiting his letters began to see his project not as an act of despair, but of transformation. He wasn't trying to die before the lens. He was trying to prove that light could witness what the human eye could not. His experiment had not been one of self-destruction, but of defiance, against mortality, against time, against the silence that follows grief. Still, one haunting question remained, a gap that no technical analysis could close. If Kent's photograph was taken at the moment his body fell, if his heart stopped before the exposure ended, then who developed the plate? The wet collodion process demanded immediacy. The glass had to be immersed in developer within minutes, or the image would vanish forever. Yet the plate that survived was flawlessly fixed, perfectly preserved. No evidence of delay, no sign of degradation. Had Kent somehow prepared a mechanism to complete the process on its own? Had someone found him moments later and finished the work? Or, as some quietly wondered, had the light itself preserved what he sought to capture, without human hand at all? The question lingers even now. For in that single plate, Elias Kent seemed to accomplish what every artist dreams of, to leave behind a piece of himself so complete that even death could not interrupt it. In 2007, when Elias Kent's photograph was finally exhibited for a brief time at the American Museum of Photography, the accompanying notes credited its rediscovery to Martha Duval, the local historian who had first found the glass plates in 1937. For decades, Duval's role had seemed purely archival, a caretaker who rescued the images from decay. But when her personal effects were catalogued by her granddaughter, nearly 70 years later, researchers uncovered something no one had seen before: her private journal, kept during the months she worked on the Kent collection. The entries were ordinary at first, descriptions of cleaning methods, storage techniques, and the fragile condition of the negatives. But halfway through the notebook, one passage stood out. Dated September 12, 1937, it read, "One plate was already developed when found, the emulsion still fresh, as though fixed by another hand long after his death. The image feels recent, though the man it shows has been gone for 60 years. For photographic historians, that single note opened a new riddle. If Kent's final glass plate had already been developed before Duval's discovery, then someone else must have processed it after his death. But who? The town's records offered few clues. Kent's only surviving relative, an older brother named Jonathan, had lived on a nearby farm but died in 1876. However, an entry buried within Montpellier's business registry listed an assistant under Kent's studio name during its final year of operation, a young apprentice named Thomas Vane. Little was known about him. Census data placed him at just 19 years old in 1873, newly arrived from New Hampshire. Newspaper notices show that he vanished from local mention only weeks after Kent's death. No obituary, no marriage record, no burial. He had simply disappeared. The trail might have ended there if not for a chance discovery in the archives of a Boston photography supplier. Among stacks of correspondence dated 1873, researchers found several letters signed T. Vane, addressed to a chemical merchant on Tremont Street. In one, Vane described experiments with reactive developer that stirs by its own warmth, and mentioned post-mortem development. Phaism, a method of letting decay itself complete the image. The phrase sent shivers through the research team. In that era, darkroom chemicals were notoriously unstable. The notion that Vane had tried to use biological heat, even decomposition, to activate the chemical reaction bordered on the macabre, but it aligned eerily with the circumstances of Kent's death. If Vane had arrived shortly after discovering his mentor's body, might he have used the lingering warmth of the room, or of Kent himself, to finish the plate? No physical evidence confirmed the theory, but another artifact added weight to the mystery. In the same storage crate that held Kent's negatives, curators found the remains of his camera, a large wooden box, partially splintered, its brass fittings green with corrosion. Inside, the shutter mechanism had fused into place, its spring warped and cracked by oxidation. Metallurgical analysis later revealed that the damage pattern was consistent with a violent release, suggesting the shutter had fired unexpectedly, perhaps under tension. If Kent's self-triggering device had indeed malfunctioned, it might have discharged automatically, seconds before or during his collapse. The timing fits the blurred figure in the photograph, an exposure that began in life and ended in death. Taken together, the evidence forms a chilling yet almost poetic circle. The camera that Kent built may have completed its purpose without him. The apprentice who admired him may have ensured the image survived. And light, indifferent, unwavering light, bore silent witness to it all. When the restored photograph was displayed in controlled conditions, it was shown for only 10 days. Viewers described it in quiet, almost reverent tones. There was nothing grotesque about it, only stillness. The man standing in the frame appeared calm, eyes distant, posture composed. But in the faint mirror behind him, a darker outline drooped forward, like the echo of a man surrendering to gravity. The exhibition drew lines around the mystery rather than resolving it. One camp argued for science, a mechanical accident, a technical marvel born of chance. Another spoke of transcendence, of a man whose final act blurred the boundary between matter and meaning. Two realities, equally haunting, continue to coexist. In one, Elias Kent was a craftsman whose last experiment ended in tragedy, his photograph a coincidence of physics. In the other, he was something rarer, an artist who achieved the impossible, using light to glimpse the instant between existence and absence. And somewhere between those two truths lies the image itself, unchanged, quietly waiting, a century-old reminder that even in death, the human desire to be seen endures. When the restored photograph of Elias Kent went on public display in 2007, it was housed in a climate-controlled glass case at the American Museum of Photography in Washington, D.C. For 10 quiet days, visitors moved slowly through the dim gallery, whispering to one another as if standing in a chapel. Few photographs have ever carried such an atmosphere of reverence or unease. The image's legend spread quickly. Newspapers called it the death self-portrait. Scholars debated its authenticity on late-night panels and in specialized journals. Skeptics dismissed it as nothing more than a double exposure, a mechanical fluke misread by modern eyes hungry for mystery. But others, including respected art historians and cultural critics, saw it differently. They called it the first self-documentation of death. The museum's curators faced uncomfortable questions. Who owned the rights to a photograph of a man's death? Could such an image be ethically displayed, or was it a form of exploitation, an intrusion upon a moment never meant for public view? The debate intensified when Kent's distant descendants, located through genealogical archives, filed an injunction to remove the photo from exhibition. They argued that the image represented an act of private passage, not artistic intent. For months, the legal and moral arguments played out in quiet meetings and published essays. Some saw Kent as a tragic innovator who merged art with mortality. Others viewed him as a victim of his own fixation, a man consumed by the medium he worshipped. Through it all, the photograph itself remained mute, unchanging. It did not explain or defend. It simply existed, the way light always has, reflecting, recording, never interpreting. The cultural ripple extended beyond the museum walls. Artists, philosophers, and psychologists began referencing Kent in discussions about human self-documentation. In an age of cameras on every phone, the act of recording one's own life, and even death, no longer seemed inconceivable. His experiment, once a Victorian anomaly, now echoed eerily in modern habits of filming, streaming, and preserving every passing moment. Elias Kent, who once stood alone in a wooden studio beneath an oil lamp, had unknowingly anticipated a world where millions would point their lenses inward, searching for permanence in the face of mortality. Historians now call his photograph a mirror, not of death, but of our obsession with outlasting it. It bridges 2 centuries of yearning, from wet glass plates to digital pixels, bound by the same fragile desire to prove we were here, if only for an instant. In the end, experts still cannot say whether the image marks the moment of death or only its shadow. What endures is not the mystery itself, but the quiet intention behind it, a man's belief that light could speak for him when he no longer could. For Elias Kent, the camera was not a witness. It was his confessor. Photography has always promised something it cannot truly deliver: permanence. Every photograph is a stillness pretending to be eternal, a fragment of time resisting its own decay. We look into these captured moments searching for continuity, but what we find instead is absence, gently framed in light. Elias Kent's story reminds us of the cost of that illusion, the quiet toll of wanting to be remembered not for the life we lived, but for the moment we left it. His lens, meant to preserve others, turned inward at last, seeking proof that he too had existed, that his presence could outlast the silence waiting beyond the shutter. And in that search, he revealed something deeply human, our refusal to vanish. The photograph he left behind is less about death than about defiance, the stubborn belief that memory can be fixed in silver, that light can hold what flesh cannot. Time continues, and Kent's glass plate still endures, fragile, translucent, yet alive with his intention. He believed the camera could keep his soul alive, and in a way it did.